Hello and welcome to another edition of the Osteopathic Lyceum podcast. Going to go through a paper that I just heard about, or at least the abstract, from a paper I just heard about from a scientific author, or what's a better term? No, those aren't good terms. Anyways, she's a neuroscientist, Dr. Lisa Feldman-Barrett. So it's a paper that I heard Dr. Lisa Feldman-Barrett talking about in a keynote speech that she and her lab had just recently done. Now, she's not the first author, but it's done in her lab, so she's part of this paper. The reason I want to talk about it is because I see an opportunity for people with an osteopathy to use something like this paper to overfit or overinterpret the finding and try to fit it in to explain things that they're already doing, especially within the realm of cranial osteopathy or osteopathy in the cranial field or craniosacral, whatever term floats your boat or you're more attached to. There is something that the lab did, specifically with periaqueductal gray, and I'll read the abstract so that it becomes a little bit more obvious, but my aim here is to show how if you read this a particular way, you'll say, see, this is why it works so good. And it's over-interpreting and overfitting something that is currently essentially very narrow in its findings and its explanatory power. It doesn't mean that it can't turn into an appropriate explanation for some of the stuff that cranial osteopathic practitioners do. It just means it's not likely because they're going to post hoc try to fit this in. This isn't what was predicted with respect to osteopathy in the cranial field. So a little bit of rambling, please excuse that. I'm going to read from the abstract. So I'll read the title and then I'll read from the abstract and I'll comment as I go. So the title is 7 Tesla Evidence for Columnar and Rostral Caudal Organization of the Human Periaqueductal Gray Response in the Absence of Threat, a Working Memory Study. So really, really superficially, you know this is about working memory. You know where this is taking place, the periaqueductal gray. The periaqueductal gray is, and we'll say this in here, often related to essentially the organization and threat response. But they're trying to see what it does when you're asked to do something that has nothing to do with threat or impending threat or active threat. Okay, so I will read the abstract. The periaqueductal gray, PAG, is a small midbrain structure that surrounds the cerebral aqueduct. Regulates brain-body communication, is often studied for its role in fight or flight and freezing responses to threat. So I'll pause here. The reason that I happen to think that people in the cranial world may get a hold of this and overinterpret is because she's talking about the cerebral aqueduct specifically. So the reasoning that I would predict would go something like this. See, there's something going on in close relationship to the cerebral aqueduct, so that must mean that it has something to do with cerebral spinous fluid and pulsation, and that's how the tides are impacting the brain and then regulating the body because it's so close, and it's got to be mechanical. So it doesn't mean that it isn't mechanical. They didn't look at it that way. As far as we can tell, these are not necessarily specifically mechanoreceptive neurons, right? Especially in this location. So there's a lot more that one would have to do to make the argument that because there's a structure that surrounds the cerebral aqueduct that happens to relate highly to the autonomic nervous system, that it's the reason that there's a problem is because the cerebral spinous fluid isn't pulsating properly and blah, 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 on down the line. With the knowledge that the claims that are made within cranial osteopathy about how CSF flows, how CSF pulsation occurs, doesn't seem to match up with current evidence. It's an old view that hasn't been updated with updated information that is available. So got some problems there. Anyways, that's commentary. I'll return to reading. We use ultra-high field 7T fMRI, so 7 Tesla functional MRI, to resolve the PAG in humans and distinguish it from the cerebral aqueduct, examining its in vivo functioning during a working memory task, N equals 87. Both mild and moderate cognitive demands elicited spatially similar patterns of whole brain blood oxygenation level dependent response, or BOLD response. and moderate cognitive demand elicited widespread bold increases above baseline in the brainstem. Note, so to talk about that, they're talking about blood flow patterns. So the fundamental assumption in fMRI of the brain is that if we track blood flow, we're tracking at least location of neural activity, because as neural activity occurs, cerebral blood flow seems to go there. Cerebral blood flow does not tell you which specific neurons are firing. It tells you where blood is flowing, under the assumption that where blood is flowing is where activity is happening. So it doesn't explain appropriately more than the location of the blood flow and the understood but assumed relationship between blood flow and activity, right? So it's a pretty strong relationship, but you're not going to necessarily reverse engineer a thought out of blood flow patterns to the level of granularity that some may be afraid of, right? So I'll go back into reading. Okay. Yeah, there. Maybe I read this. No, I did not read this. Please excuse me for the little hiccup. Notably, these brainstem increases were not significantly greater than those in the mild demand condition, suggesting that a subthreshold brainstem bold increase occurred for mild cognitive demand as well. Subject-specific masks were group aligned to examine PAG response. That's methodological. So essentially they're saying that there was a way that they kind of masked certain things in the methodology when they were analyzing, or at least that's what I interpret from that, and I could be wrong. The full text is available, but the point I'm attempting to make seems to be possible while coming from the abstract. In PAG, to read again, in PAG, both mild and moderate demands elicited a well-defined response in ventrolateral PAG, a region thought to be functionally related to anticipated painful threat in humans and non-human animals. Yet the present tasks pose only the most minimal, if any, threat, in air quotes, with the cognitive tasks being approximately as challenging as remembering a phone number. These findings suggest that the PAG may play a more general role in visceral motor regulation, even in the absence of threat. So something that has previously been interpreted to be more about the fight, flight, freezing response seems to activate in basic memory tasks. So in saying that, what you're able to tease out, so if it was only in relation to threat, if it activated only in relation to threat and it was a fight, flight, or freeze area, then you should not see increases in activity when you do a basic memory task. But because you see increases in activity in basic memory tasks, you can then extrapolate and predict that it may be involved in other stuff. And you can probably do that to some degree, tracking the neuronal paths and how they will enter into organ fields. So anytime you have something with respect to the autonomic nervous system, you can then relate that to both sensation and motor superficially to organ fields or to visceral areas. So my concern, to try to get ahead of this, is that people in the cranial osteopathic realm can overinterpret this and say, C, cerebral aqueduct, cerebral aqueduct, cerebral aqueduct. It's so close. It's got to be cerebrospinous fluid. They didn't check that. They checked activation through the proxy of blood flow. They weren't looking, so they didn't necessarily see, and maybe it's in here and I didn't look, anything with respect to cerebrospinous fluid. They're looking at activation in areas, neurological activation in brain areas based on blood flow proxies. So I'm going to read something else that they have here before the full text. It says the significant statement. The paraqueductal gray, PAG, is thought to control survival-related behavior and is typically studied using experiments that manipulate threat. Others have proposed that the PAG plays a more general role in bodily regulation, but studies examining PAG function outside of threat-based experimental contexts are rare. We used high-resolution fMRI to examine PAG response in humans during a working memory task which involves minimal threat. Moderate cognitive demands elicited a well-defined response in ventrolateral PAG, a functional subregion thought to coordinate a freezing response to threat. A task where threat is minimal elicited a clear fMRI response in one of the most well-known survival circuits in the brain, which suggests PAG supports a more general function in brain-body coordination. So the reason that Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett happens to be important in this study is because Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett has gone through a bunch of neurological brain interfaces. She's put forth the theory of constructed emotion. So she's gone through a bunch of this, attempted to re-examine, made hypotheses based on previously thought ideas. So one of the ideas that she'll speak about often is things like anger circuits. So ideally, based on previous assumptions about the brain, one should be able to find a very well-defined circuit in the brain that represents activation related to reported anger. And there's no such thing. So she has decided to take a more fundamental scientific approach to, ask an appropriate question and attempt to figure it out through observation in a falsifiable manner, for a clunky way to say that. So essentially she's saying, I'm going to observe, see what this does, and try to understand it better. And from that point of understanding it better, I'll ask another question, another question, another question. The very, very superficial, fundamental way to say something about the theory of constructed emotion is that the body has sensory surfaces. Those sensory surfaces send information to the brain. The brain then interprets that based primarily on a previous experience so that it can better predict an output, a motor output, or an action within the body. That holds consistent with this PAG, or periaqueductal gray investigation, because the thing that she has seen over and over and over again is that when people name something for a particular function, they often are doing that as an overinterpretation of what they saw. So if I do a threat-based experiment and I look at the brain, generally speaking, and I see it light up in one area, I will say that has to be the threat interpretation or the threat coordination area in the ventrolateral PAG. So or specifically freezing with the ventrolateral PAG. So if I give somebody a task that makes them freeze, and I see the ventrolateral PAG activate in a lot of people and very consistently, then I think that that's what it's for. If I stop there and I don't ask, is it also for something else, I will miss it. It seems, based on Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett's approach, that she was willing to ask, is it for something else as well? And she seems, with her lab, so it's not specifically her who would have formulated the question, it's in her lab. So her lab would have the culture of asking, is this also for something else? So they made a prediction that it's probably also for something else. And they said, if it's also for something else, we should see some kind of activation when we do something different. And they see some kind of activation for doing something different. So that fundamentally disproves that the ventrolateral PAG is a freezing location, or a location that will generate a freezing response when threat is presented. It's not what it's for. It does that, but it also does other things. So how does that then give me the opportunity to predict a similar phenomenon in the cranial osteopathy world? Well, overfitting of data based on anatomical possibilism. So if you look back through the Osteopathic Lyceum podcast, you'll see me talking about an article which was really more of a commentary in the International Journal of Osteopathic Medicine using the term anatomical possibilism. It's a term coined by the authors, essentially saying that classically osteopathy says because anatomy is here, it must mean this. So it's an interpretive step based on the assumption that there are anatomical relationships to health and disease states. This is disproven through long-term imaging studies that show anatomical variation does not accurately relate to functional impairment necessarily, or pain states, or reported pain states, things like that. So there's a large study over time where they took a bunch of images of healthy people, quote unquote healthy people, and they would find a lot of anatomical abnormalities that people would predict would cause functional impairment or pain. and none was reported. So these people reported no symptomatology, and they were found with things like slap tears, things like disc herniations, things like labral tears in the hip, and they reported no functional impairment or pain. So you can have the presence of anatomical abnormality and no report of pain. That is a thing. So you can have something close to the cerebral aqueduct, which would have some relationship. So the cerebral aqueduct is going to carry cerebrospinous fluid. Cerebrospinous fluid will pulse. Cerebrospinal fluid will pulse, likely for varying reasons. There are varying hypotheses as to how that pulsation is generated. One of them happens to be arterial pulsation and respiration. Especially when you combine those, you seem to have something powerful to say that the cerebrospinous fluid pulsation is because arteries pulse, and there's a waveform that's generated within the skull that travels across the cerebrospinous fluid, and that pulsation also is generated to some degree by respiration, right? So there will be tension, and not necessarily tension, there will be mechanical deformation of the body, or mechanical change of the body, including the brain and the spinal cord, in relation to thoracic respiration. And that will generate things like vacuum pressure or changes in pressure that will help move cerebrospinous fluid. So it seems to be superficially at least a combined mechanism between arterial pulsation and breathing. But because cranial osteopathy fundamentally believes that cerebrospinous fluid is the center of everything, and the tides and things like that, so the pulsation of fluid that washes over all cells, they can easily take this with that anatomical possibilism concept. It's a recently coined term based on observing how people say anatomy here, thing here, go together, explains. You can see how it's possible as the cranial field gets a hold of this particular thing, whether it's now or whether it's in the future, they can say, see, it's close to this visceromotor coordination center, and the ventrolateral PAG is so close to the cerebral aqueduct, it has to be related. And when there's something wrong, it has to be related to that, because the cerebrospinous fluid's off. So the reason that their organ function is off is because the ventrolateral PAG is having abnormal mechanical signals to it through cerebrospinous fluid. No, probably not. You're probably overinterpreting it. So if I say this now, there's a timestamp for when I put this up on YouTube, such that anybody looking at it over time, if they stumble across what I've said, they have the chance to see that I have made a prediction, I've put it out in public, and it's completely fine if my prediction's wrong. I'd prefer that I'm wrong. I would prefer that people in cranial osteopathy would get a hold of this and say, yeah, it's probably not a thing for us. This is probably not why we have visceral dysfunction, because the ventrolateral PAG is so close to the cerebral aqueduct. I'd prefer that. But I'm making this prediction so I can put something out there to try to get ahead of it, such that there is at least a conversation that can begin between overfitting this and recognizing that this is currently something that was observed and explained in one way in one study. So there's at least the beginning of a scientific conversation, and there's a beginning of a conversation from that within osteopathy by me saying, I don't think this means what you're going to think that it means, and give you some rationale why. So if you've listened thus far, thank you very much. Hopefully you've learned something, and we'll talk again soon.